Long before the first sword was drawn or the first ship set sail, the seeds of the Trojan War were planted not on a battlefield, but at a wedding feast among the gods. This was the celebration of Peleus, a mortal king, and Thetis, a sea nymph. It was a grand and joyous occasion, and almost every deity was invited. Almost. One goddess was intentionally left off the guest list, Eris, the spirit of strife and discord. The organizers knew that her presence would only bring arguments and misery, so they chose to exclude her entirely. This decision, meant to preserve peace, was the very thing that shattered it. Eris, however, was not so easily ignored. Furious at the slight, she arrived at the banquet hall uninvited, her energy crackling with silent rage. She did not scream or fight. She simply threw a single, beautiful golden apple onto the table where the most powerful goddesses were seated. Inscribed on its gleaming skin was a simple phrase, "For the fairest." The apple just sat there, a quiet, golden bomb in the middle of a party. Immediately, 3 goddesses reached for it. Hera, the queen of the gods and wife of Zeus, believed her status alone entitled her to the prize. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategic war, saw the apple as a recognition of her powerful intellect and skill. And Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, felt the title of the fairest was, without question, her birthright. The hall fell into a tense silence as the 3 goddesses began to argue. Their divine voices grew sharp and cold, and the happiness of the wedding curdled into a bitter rivalry. No one could resolve the dispute, least of all Zeus, the king of the gods. He was far too clever to judge a beauty contest between his own wife and 2 of his most formidable daughters. He needed a mortal, someone with no divine baggage, to make the impossible choice. He pointed his finger down from Mount Olympus to the green hills and rocky plains of the mortal world, right at a hillside near the city of Troy. There, tending his sheep, was a young prince who did not yet know he was a prince. His name was Paris, and the fate of an entire civilization was about to be placed in his hands. Prince Paris was no ordinary shepherd, though he lived the simple life of one. He was, in truth, a son of King Priam of Troy, a powerful and wealthy city on the coast of what is now Turkey. Before Paris was born, a prophecy had declared that he would one day be the ruin of his homeland. Terrified, King Priam and Queen Hecuba sent their newborn son to be exposed on Mount Ida, leaving him to the elements so the prophecy could not come true. But fate had other plans. A she-bear nursed the baby, and a shepherd found him and raised him as his own. So it was on this mountainside, far from the marble halls of his true family, that the divine messenger Hermes found him with the 3 quarreling goddesses. Hermes explained the task to the stunned young man. He, a simple herdsman, was to decide which of these 3 resplendent beings was the fairest. The pressure was unimaginable. There was no refusing the gods. The 3 goddesses, each radiant and terrifying in her own way, approached Paris not with a simple plea, but with a bribe. It was a divine auction, and the currency was the power of the universe itself. Hera stepped forward first, her bearing that of absolute authority. She promised Paris political dominion. If he chose her, she would make him the lord of all Europe and Asia, a ruler of vast continents, a king of kings with power that stretched across the known world. Athena came next, her gray eyes clear and sharp as a spear's point. She did not promise land or crowns, which she saw as fleeting and crude. Her offer was supreme skill in warfare and wisdom that no other mortal could match. She promised to make him the greatest strategist and warrior, a man whose mind and arm would never be defeated in battle, earning glory that would echo through the ages. Paris listened, the weight of the decision crushing him. But then Aphrodite, with a knowing smile, made her promise. She did not speak of territorial power or strategic genius. She spoke of love, but a very specific kind. She promised him the most beautiful mortal woman in the entire world. Her name was Helen of Sparta, and she would be his. For the young, romantic Prince Paris, the choice was suddenly simple. Power and wisdom meant nothing compared to the love of the world's most stunning woman. He gave the golden apple to Aphrodite. The moment Paris handed the golden apple to Aphrodite, he sealed his own destiny and the destruction of his city. Hera and Athena, consumed by a cold and implacable fury, turned away. Their divine faces were not twisted in screaming rage, but set into masks of grim resolve. They were not angry at just Paris, they now held a deep and undying hatred for his entire bloodline and the city of Troy itself. They would not forget this insult. While Aphrodite began to orchestrate her side of the bargain, Paris's life took an unexpected turn. A series of events led him back to the royal court of Troy, where his true identity as a prince was revealed. King Priam and Queen Hecuba, overjoyed to see their son alive and a strong, handsome man, completely ignored the old prophecy. They welcomed him into the palace with open arms, and the abandoned shepherd became a Trojan prince once more. Emboldened by his new status and driven by Aphrodite's promise, Paris was tasked with a diplomatic mission to Greece. He was to travel across the sea to the city-state of Sparta, a land of warriors. The goddess's promise was a compass in his heart, and it led him directly to the court of King Menelaus. Menelaus was a powerful and hospitable king, married to a woman whose beauty was a legend across all lands. This was Helen. When Paris saw her, he understood. She was not just beautiful, her face possessed a kind of perfection that seemed to come from the gods themselves. She was the physical embodiment of Aphrodite's promise. Menelaus, trusting his guest, treated Paris with honor and respect, never suspecting the prince's secret mission. Then, Menelaus was called away to attend a funeral in Crete. He left his palace, his treasures, and his wife in the care of his Trojan guest. It was the opportunity Paris had been waiting for, the moment Aphrodite's power truly took hold. The goddess of love enveloped Helen in a haze of enchantment and desire. In some stories, she was swept off her feet by the charming foreign prince. In others, the divine influence was so powerful it overpowered her own will. The reality of her choice is a mystery. What is not a mystery is what happened next. Helen and Paris gathered her personal belongings and a portion of the royal treasury and fled the palace under cover of darkness. They raced to Paris's ship and set sail for Troy, leaving behind an empty bed and a broken sacred bond. When Menelaus returned to find his guest gone and his wife vanished, the rage that filled him was like a physical fire. His wife had been seduced and stolen. This was not just a personal betrayal, it was a monumental violation of hospitality, an insult that demanded a response of total war. The cry for vengeance that rose from Menelaus's shattered home was not a solitary scream. It was a call that bound almost every kingdom in ancient Greece. To understand why, you have to go back in time, to the moment when Helen, the world's most beautiful woman, first came of age. Suitors, the best and brightest princes and kings from every corner of Greece, flocked to her father's palace, each bearing extravagant gifts and hoping to win her hand. They were a volatile group, these warrior chieftains full of pride and ambition. Helen's father, King Tyndareus, was terrified. He knew that the moment he picked one man to marry his daughter, all the others would be consumed with jealousy and fury, potentially turning on the winner and plunging the land into a chaotic civil war. It was Odysseus, the clever king of the small island of Ithaca, who devised a solution. He had not yet come to his own fame, but his mind was already legendary. He went to Tyndareus with a deal. He would provide the perfect plan to avoid disaster, and in return, he asked for the king's support in marrying Penelope, Helen's clever and loyal cousin. The agreement was made. Odysseus's plan was brilliantly simple. Before a single suitor learned who the winner would be, Tyndareus made every single one of them swear a solemn, binding oath. They placed their hands on the bloody pieces of a sacrificed horse and swore to the gods that they would defend the chosen husband, whoever he was, against any man who wronged him in connection with this marriage. They swore to come to his aid with men and ships, to protect Helen's honor forever. With the oath sworn, Menelaus was chosen, and he lived happily with Helen for years, until Paris shattered the peace. Now, that ancient oath was triggered. Menelaus went to his older brother, Agamemnon, the powerful king of Mycenae, the closest thing Greece had to a high king. Agamemnon saw not just a family tragedy but a political opportunity to unite the Greeks and destroy a rival power in the east. Messengers fanned out across the sea and mountains, to the halls of every man who had sworn that oath so long ago. The call was for them to honor their word, to assemble their armies and ships for an invasion of Troy. In Ithaca, Odysseus had a young wife and a newborn son, and he wanted no part of a war. When the messengers arrived, he feigned madness, yoking a donkey and an ox to his plow and sowing his fields with salt. But the messenger, Palamedes, was just as clever. He placed Odysseus's infant son in the path of the plow. Odysseus swerved to avoid harming his child, proving his sanity and binding him to the oath. One by one, the kings and heroes, bound by honor and that bloody promise, gathered at the port of Aulis, assembling the greatest army the world had ever seen. The harbor at Aulis was a breathtaking and terrifying sight. Over 1,000 black ships were dragged onto the sand, their masts a leafless forest against the sky. The air was thick with the sounds of men shouting, metal clanking, and horses neighing. Heroes from legend stood shoulder to shoulder, a gathering of might the world would never forget. There was the giant Ajax, a mountain of a man wielding a shield so massive it was like a tower, slow to speak but impossible to move in battle. There was the other Ajax, known as Little Ajax, fast and vicious. And there was Diomedes, a warrior so fearsome he would later wound gods on the battlefield. But the greatest of all the warriors, the one who would become the central figure of the war, was not yet there. A troubling prophecy hovered over the gathering. A seer named Calchas, who read the flight of birds and the future, had declared that the city of Troy would never fall without a man named Achilles. Achilles was the son of the sea nymph Thetis, the very same woman whose wedding had started this whole chain of events. He was practically invincible, a demigod of supreme speed and lethal grace. His mother, knowing of the prophecy and desperate to save her son from a violent death in Troy, had hidden him away. She disguised him as a girl and placed him in the court of King Lycomedes on the island of Skyros. There, among the princesses, Achilles lived a secret life, his divine strength hidden beneath a maiden's dress. The task of finding him fell to Odysseus, the master of tricks. He sailed to Skyros with a merchant's chest full of fine cloth and jewelry for the princesses, but he also placed a magnificent sword and shield among the wares. While the real princesses admired the gowns and gems, one of them was drawn to the weapons with a warrior's eye. As Odysseus had planned, he gave a sudden, sharp battle cry from outside the hall. The real girls fled in panic, but Achilles, in a moment of pure instinct, ripped off his dress and snatched the sword and shield, ready to fight. His identity was exposed. Odysseus's words were calm but firm. Glory awaited him. His name would live forever. Achilles, bound by a thirst for an immortal legacy, chose to sail for Troy, knowing it would be his grave. The fleet was complete, but the gods were not finished testing them. The wind stopped. For days, then weeks, the sea was a sheet of glass. The seer Calchas delivered a horrifying verdict from the goddess Artemis. Agamemnon, the leader of the expedition, had offended her. The only way to bring back the wind was for him to sacrifice his own innocent daughter, Iphigenia. In a moment of chilling ambition, Agamemnon sent for his daughter under a lie, claiming she was to marry the hero Achilles. She arrived at the camp full of joy and hope, only to be led to the altar. In some tales, Artemis saved her at the last second, but the image of a father killing his child for a fair wind casts a long, dark shadow over the entire Greek fleet as the sails finally filled and the ships pointed their prows toward Troy. The black ships of the Greeks appeared on the horizon like a coming storm. For the people of Troy, who had spent nearly a decade watching the sea, it was a moment of sheer terror. The Greek fleet, 1,000 strong, hit the beaches in a massive, roaring wave. But the Trojans were not a passive enemy. They were a mighty eastern power, led by Hector, the eldest son of King Priam, a prince who was everything his brother Paris was not. Where Paris was beautiful and romantic, Hector was a rock of duty, courage, and deep love for his city and his family. He knew the war his brother had started was a tragedy, but as protector of Troy, he would fight it to his last breath. He met the Greeks on the shoreline with a wall of spears and a storm of arrows. The first Greek soldier to leap off a ship was the very first to die. This fulfilled another prophecy, one that said the first to touch Trojan soil would be the first to fall. The man's name was Protesilaus, and he knew this prophecy. He knowingly sacrificed himself for the cause, a hero whose wife, Laodamia, was left to a grief so profound that the gods themselves would later take pity on her. The battle on the beach was a chaotic, bloody mess, a desperate fight for a foothold. Greek and Trojan heroes fought through the surf, turning the white foam pink with blood. Achilles, however, was a force of nature. The Trojans had a second prophecy of their own: the first man to face Achilles would die. Sickness, a son of the god Poseidon whose skin could not be pierced by any spear, was that man. Achilles charged him, threw his spear, and watched it bounce harmlessly off the demigod's throat. He tried again with his sword, and the blade just clanged and shattered. But Achilles, a demigod himself, simply dropped his weapons, charged Sickness like a wild animal, and choked him to death with the straps of his own helmet. The psychological blow to the Trojans was immense, and they retreated behind their colossal, god-built walls. For the next 9 years, the war was not a siege in the way we often imagine. It was a long, grinding conflict of attrition. The Greeks never fully encircled the city. Instead, they raided dozens of smaller towns and allied islands up and down the coast, cutting off Troy's supply lines and sacking temples for treasure and women. Achilles was the master of these raids, a lightning-fast destroyer who captured countless prizes. The main armies would emerge from the city and fight pitched battles on the plain between the walls and the Greek camp, a no-man's land of dust, blood, and bronze armor. The war became a world of heroes doing glorious and terrible things, a static grind where honor was won and lost in single combat. This brutal routine continued year after year, with neither side able to land a decisive blow, until a single, personal conflict inside the Greek camp threatened to tear the invading army apart from the inside. The spark that nearly destroyed the Greeks from within had a name: Briseis. She was a princess of a Trojan allied town, captured by Achilles during one of his devastating raids. She was his prize, a physical token of his honor and prowess in battle. The leader of the Greek army, Agamemnon, had also captured a woman, a daughter of a priest of Apollo. When the priest came to the Greek camp with a magnificent ransom, begging for his daughter's return, Agamemnon cruelly and publicly shamed him, sending him away. This was a fatal mistake. The priest prayed to Apollo, and the sun god, the lord of the silver bow, descended from Olympus with silent, deadly fury. For 9 days, his plague arrows fell upon the Greek camp, striking down the dogs first and then the men. Funeral pyres burned day and night. Achilles, seeing his men dying pointlessly, called an assembly. The seer Calchas, protected by Achilles' promise of safety, revealed the cause of the plague. Agamemnon had insulted the god, and the only cure was to return the captive girl to her father without any ransom. The entire army saw the truth of this. Agamemnon, his eyes burning with wounded pride, was trapped. He agreed to give the girl back to save the army, but he immediately demanded another prize to replace her, to prove he was still the supreme king. His gaze fell upon Briseis, Achilles' treasure. To Agamemnon, taking another man's prize was the ultimate display of power. Achilles saw this for what it was, a public stripping of his honor, a humiliation in front of the entire army he had bled for. The rage that filled him, the Menes, was a cosmic, world-shaking wrath. He drew his sword to kill Agamemnon on the spot, but the invisible hand of the goddess Athena grabbed his hair, holding him back. She spoke only to him, promising him a greater reward if he held his temper. So, Achilles chose a different kind of destruction. He did not kill his commander. Instead, he walked away. He surrendered Briseis and then retreated to his ships, vowing on his sacred scepter that neither he nor his elite warriors, the Myrmidons, would fight another day. He went to the seashore and wept bitter tears to his divine mother, Thetis. He asked her to use her influence with Zeus, the king of the gods. He wanted the Trojans to win, to push the Greeks back to their ships and slaughter them, so that Agamemnon would see, in the blood of his own men, the true value of the warrior he had shamed. Thetis, saddened for her son whose life was destined to be so brilliant and so short, ascended to Olympus and clasped the knees of Zeus, begging for this favor. Zeus, with a heavy nod that shook the mountain, agreed. The greatest warrior in the Greek army was now sitting on the sidelines, praying for his own side to lose. A deathly quiet settled over the Myrmidon camp, and on the plains of Troy, the Trojans saw their opportunity. With Achilles gone, the morale of the Greek army plummeted. Seeing this, the Trojan prince Hector felt a surge of hope for the first time in 9 years. He rallied his forces and launched a massive assault against the Greek camp. The fighting was ferocious. One by one, the great Greek heroes fell wounded. The giant Ajax held the line like a human fortress, but even he was slowly being overwhelmed. The Greeks were pushed back across the plain and behind a defensive wall they had built to protect their ships, the very thing they had never thought they would need. Hector, in a chariot driven by a divine fury, was unstoppable. He broke through the Greek gate and was the first to throw fire onto a black ship. The smell of burning timber filled the air, and the screams of the Greeks carried to the tent of Achilles. It was in this darkest hour that Achilles' closest and most beloved companion, Patroclus, made a decision that would change everything. Patroclus was a kind and gentle man in a world of violence, and his heart was breaking for his dying countrymen. He rushed to Achilles with tears streaming down his face, not begging him to return, but begging him for another, almost equally fatal, favor. He asked to wear Achilles' armor. The plan was simple. If the Trojans saw the famous armor, they would think the great Achilles had returned to battle and flee in terror. Achilles, his anger now a complex knot of pride and stubbornness, agreed. But his final words to Patroclus were a desperate warning: push them away from the ships, but do not attack the city. His ego was not yet ready for the Trojans to be completely defeated by another. Patroclus donned the glittering armor, and as he charged into the fight on Achilles' chariot, the plan worked perfectly. The Trojans, believing Achilles had returned, broke and ran. Patroclus, feeling the thrill of battle and forgetting his friend's strict command, cut down warrior after warrior. He was a man possessed, pushing his luck to the very walls of Troy. But the god Apollo was watching, loyal to Troy. He struck Patroclus from behind with a massive, unseen hand, shattering his spear and knocking his helmet into the dust. Stunned and defenseless, Patroclus was an easy target. A Trojan soldier speared him from behind, but it was Hector who delivered the final, killing blow. The crowned prince of Troy stood over the dying Patroclus, and in the moment of his greatest victory, spoke with arrogant finality, telling the dying man that even Achilles could not have saved him. With his last breath, Patroclus made a chilling prophecy. Death and destiny were coming for Hector, and they were coming fast, at the hands of Achilles. When the news of Patroclus's death reached Achilles, the world broke. The grief that consumed him was so total, so annihilating, that it extinguished his rage at Agamemnon in an instant. That old anger seemed like a childish game. This new, cold, and pure fury was directed at one man and one man alone, Hector. Achilles threw himself into the dirt, tearing at his hair and letting out a scream so raw and piercing that his divine mother, Thetis, heard it from the depths of the sea. She rose with all her sea nymphs, mourning with her son, but she knew his mind was already made up. He was going to kill Hector. The only problem was he had no armor. His divine set, the one worn by Patroclus, had been stripped from his friend's body by Hector as a trophy and was now being paraded inside the walls of Troy. So, Thetis went to the god of the forge, Hephaestus, and asked him to create a new set of armor fit for a demigod. Hephaestus crafted a masterpiece beyond mortal comprehension, including a shield that was a work of cosmic art, depicting the entire world in intricate detail, cities at peace, cities at war, fields of grain, and the circling ocean. The next morning, Thetis placed this gift before her son. Achilles, armored in divine radiance, stood before the Greek army. He publicly reconciled with Agamemnon, his voice devoid of emotion. He was a weapon now, and a weapon cares nothing for petty squabbles. The Trojans had never seen anything like him. Achilles charged onto the plain of Troy, and a massacre unfolded. He was not fighting men, he was slaughtering livestock. The Trojan army broke and ran for the Scaean gates, a panicked river of humanity desperate for shelter. All fled, except one. Hector, the prince of Troy, stood alone outside the massive walls. He had ordered the gates closed to save his people, and he knew what he had to face. But when Achilles appeared in his new, otherworldly armor, his eyes burning with a fire hotter than the sun, a cold terror gripped Hector's heart. He ran. The two men, the greatest warrior of the age and the most noble protector, ran 3 times around the great walls of Troy. It was a race for an entire civilization, watched by the horrified citizens above and the silent gods from the heavens. Finally, the goddess Athena, disguised as Hector's brother, tricked him into stopping. Hector turned to face his fate. The duel was short and brutal. Hector asked for a pact, that the winner would respect the other's body. Achilles refused with a chilling hiss. He was no longer a man. He was an instrument of vengeance. With a single, perfect thrust of his spear, he found the gap in Hector's armor at the throat and killed him. As Hector died, he gasped out the same prophecy Patroclus had given, promising Achilles was next. Achilles, unfazed, did the unthinkable. He pierced the ankles of the dead hero, tied his body to the back of his chariot, and dragged his noble, fallen enemy through the dust in front of his screaming family on the ramparts. The rage of Achilles was complete, but it was a desecration that offended even the gods. The death of Hector was not the end of the war. Achilles, after being begged by an old king Priam who had snuck into the Greek camp and kissed the hands that had killed his son, finally returned Hector's body for a proper burial. There was a brief truce, a moment of pure humanity in a world of bronze and blood. But the war went on. Achilles fought on, knowing his own death was near. It did not come from another hero, but from Paris, the man who started it all. Guided by Apollo, Paris fired a poisoned arrow from his coward's bow, and it struck Achilles in his only vulnerable spot, his heel. The greatest warrior of the age was killed by the greatest lover. After the death of Achilles and the giant Ajax, the Greeks were exhausted and on the verge of despair. 10 years of war had yielded nothing but heroes' graves. It was time not for a sword, but for a mind. Odysseus, the man of many schemes, walked to the edge of the surf and looked at the imposing, impenetrable walls of Troy. As he looked at the vast forests behind the beach, an idea began to form. It was a plan born of complete desperation, a final, all-or-nothing roll of the dice. He ordered the best shipwrights and craftsmen, under the watchful eye of the goddess Athena, to construct something the world had never seen. Not a siege tower or a battering ram, but a monument. They built a colossal wooden horse, a hollow and magnificent beast, and carved into its side a lying inscription dedicating it to Athena for a safe journey home. They then burned their own camp, creating a massive cloud of black smoke visible for miles. The entire Greek army boarded their ships, but instead of sailing for home, they hid their vessels just behind the nearby island of Tenedos. The empty beach was left with only one thing, the horse. The Trojans, emerging from their walls for the first time in a decade, found an empty, smoking wasteland and a giant wooden statue. Confusion and hope swept through the city. A debate erupted. The priest Laocoon, sensing the trap, hurled his spear at the horse's side, producing a hollow echo, and famously cried out that he feared the Greeks even when they bore gifts. But the gods were on the side of the Greeks' final trick. 2 massive sea serpents emerged from the waves and crushed Laocoon and his sons to death. At the same time, a Greek spy named Sinon was found by the Trojans. He spun a perfect tale of lies, claiming he was a deserter and that the horse was a sacred offering that, if brought inside the city, would make Troy invincible. The Trojans, their minds clouded by a decade of terror and a desperate hope for peace, ignored the echoes and the prophecies. They tore down a section of their own impenetrable wall, the wall that had protected them for 10 years, and dragged the heavy, hollow horse into the sacred center of their city. That night, as Troy celebrated its supposed victory with wine and song, they had no idea they had delivered their own doom inside the gates. In the dead of night, a trapdoor opened under the belly of the horse. A stream of silent, bronze-armored killers, led by Odysseus, descended. They opened the city gates to the Greek army, which had silently returned under cover of darkness. The slaughter was absolute. Men were killed in their beds. The city was put to the torch. The noble King Priam was cut down on his own altar. The queen and the princesses were dragged away into slavery. A civilization that had stood for centuries was reduced to ash and screaming shadows in a single, final night. The Trojan War was over, not with a heroic battle cry, but with a silent, deadly trick that would echo through eternity as the ultimate lesson in strategy, deception, and the terrifying finality of a gift that should never have been accepted.